Welcome everybody. My name is Gayatri R, and it gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you all to the first ever Danon Disease Day. As this community knows, we were really working hard to try to bring everybody together in person for the first ever Danon Disease Day. But right at the eve of the event, the numbers for COVID-19 were rising. So we had to make the very difficult decision to cancel the event at the time. But we're grateful that we're all able to come together today, at least virtually, to talk about some issues that I think might be top of mind for this community. So our goal today is really to answer your questions in the community about the gene therapy clinical trial, about Danon disease, about the natural history, and anything else that might be on your mind. We're going to do our best to answer. Now, we really want this to try and be as interactive as possible. Latika, if we could go to the next slide. Let's do some housekeeping here. I know by now, living in the virtual world that we are, everyone's probably a Zoom expert by this point, but just in case, if you do have any questions, please just hover your mouse at the bottom and you will see the chat icon. Please just click on that chat icon and type in your question, and we've got folks monitoring the chat and we will do our best to answer those questions in real time. If we don't get a chance to get to all of the questions, we will do our best to follow up with you with answers to the questions you've posed. If you're having any trouble getting on this Zoom or you have challenges, please just call my colleague, Latika. You see her phone number here. If you're joining us internationally and calling will be a challenge, there is an email address that you can write to, and we will do our best to sort through your technical issues. Next slide, please. I think you've all met me by now. Again, my name is Gayatri R. I wear a lot of different hats for Rocket Pharma, but one of the hats that I love wearing is my patient advocacy hat, so I'm just really pleased to be with all of you today. Now, before we get started, it would be really helpful for us to kind of know who's with us right now. So, for those of you who are in the audience, here's our first polling question. We'd love to know, where do you live? And there should be a pop-up that comes up, and you should be able to click on which region of the United States you're joining us from, or whether you're coming to us from Europe, Central or South America, Australia, New Zealand, Asia, or Africa. Now, I know we've got panelists, and I'm sure you're probably tempted to vote as well, but this is not for you. Okay, Paulina, do we need another minute, or can we see our results?
Just a little bit, we're almost there.
Okay.
A few more.
So we're just very interested to know who's joining us, because we've heard from the community from all over the world with respect to all of the different research efforts that are going on. And our hope is to be able to share this, even if not today, but the recording with the larger community. Okay, let's see who's joining us. I feel like I'm hosting a game show here. It looks like we've got folks from all over, mostly from the US, which is not really a surprise, but we've got some folks joining us from Europe, from Australia, and from Asia. Thank you so much for being with us, especially those of you who are in some crazy time zones right now. So, next question. Which of the following best describes you? Are you A, Danon disease patient, B, a caregiver, C, both a patient and a caregiver, and this applies to, say, a mom who may be caring for a son with Danon disease or a daughter with Danon disease. D, a friend or family member of a patient with Danon disease. E, a healthcare provider caring for Danon disease patients, or other. So we'll give you all a quick minute to answer this question. Paulina, do we need a little bit more time?
No, we just finished now.
Perfect. So let's see who's joining us today. It looks like 30% of participants as of right now, and I anticipate we'll probably get more as the next 90 minutes progresses, are Danon disease patients, followed closely by friends or family members of a patient with Danon disease. And then we've got some caregivers with us. And we've got a few others, so I'm interested to see who the others are at some point. Okay, well, thank you so much for answering those questions. Shall we go to the next slide, please? And here's our agenda for today. As many of you know, we've distributed videos thanks to Dr. Taylor and Dr. Adler and Dr. Schwartz on Danon 101, about the natural history of Danon disease, and some information related to our clinical trial. Because the focus of our discussion today will be in and around the clinical trial, we wanted to spend a little bit of time today, in case you didn't get a chance to see all the videos, to do a very brief Cliff Notes version of the gene therapy clinical trial for Danon disease. So everybody's sort of starting from the same footing. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is my colleague, and he is the Chief Medical Officer for Rocket Pharma. Jonathan, why don't you take it away here?
Okay, and good morning and welcome. So we'll give a very brief overview of the trial, and as Gayatri mentioned, there is a video with a bit more extensive description of the study that you're welcome to watch on your own time. Also information at clinicaltrials.gov, and then questions through the Rocket website as needed. The study is open and enrolling, and just to make sure that all are familiar, this is a phase 1 clinical trial, which is a first-in-human endeavor, and the primary goal of a phase 1 study is to determine safety and tolerability of a new medicine, in this case, the gene therapy. And because of those safety considerations, that is really why we have enrolled a relatively limited number of patients to date, and why enrollment will continue to be somewhat restricted until we have what we hope is a comprehensive handle on the safety profile and how to administer this medication with optimal safety considerations, both in the near and short term. As part of the study, we'll also be looking at a number of different things with respect to preliminary efficacy. In other words, is the medicine helping slow or reverse the progression of Danon disease or stabilize it? And that's also a very critical component of the trial as well. But the safety portion is still the most essential thing. Next slide, please. This is some of the details in terms of eligibility. This is a trial that has been set up for male patients, boys and men, starting with people 15 years of age and older, and then moving into a younger or pediatric cohort aged 8 to 14. All patients need to have confirmation of LAMP2 mutations and some degree of abnormal findings on any number of heart tests, including echocardiogram or electrocardiogram and others. Obviously, this is how we start. If things are working well, then there will definitely be a study for women as well, and I hope that that's going to be sooner than later, but more on that later. Patients are not eligible if they've already had a heart transplant. They have severely advanced heart failure, such as New York Heart Association Class 4 status, or if there is markedly abnormal liver or kidney function or other blood abnormalities that could make the investigational therapy more risky. And that's a bit of an overview as far as the eligibility. Moving to the next slide. The study is now open at 2 centers on either end of our very large country. The center that has been open over the past year is UC San Diego with Dr. Barry Greenberg, and this is also the center where the technology was developed in Dr. Eric Adler's lab. But now we also welcome Dr. Joe Rossano and his colleagues at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So now we are an East and a West Coast site, and of course we also have our sites on the middle of the country as well, but more on that later as well. Moving to the next slide. And I should also emphasize that obviously supporting Drs. Greenberg and Rossano are a very, very substantial number of research colleagues at their hospitals that will do a great deal of things to really make the study possible, both from a research and a patient-facing level. Enrollment in the clinical trial entails a number of steps, and some of these steps are similar to what one would encounter as part of the standard care for somebody with Danon disease and some heart concerns, although some of them involve some extra time and extra tests, and that's required because this is still an investigational therapy and because our mandate is to really capture as much information about the safety and how well the therapy may or may not be working. So the first encounter is really a patient screening or pre-study evaluation, which largely takes place as an outpatient, and that takes about 2 weeks, although there's likely to be some telephone and other correspondence going on in the days and weeks before that. If somebody is eligible and decides to enroll in the study, then there is another 2-week period for pre-treatment medications. And this involves the infusion and other administration of a couple of different medicines that will hopefully prevent any sort of severe immune response against the viral vector that's used as the therapy, or for that matter against any LAMP2B protein that's expressed. And this pre-treatment period is about 2 weeks and is mostly as an outpatient as well. The investigational therapy involves a single day. In fact, the treatment itself is administered really over the course of an hour or two. And during that time, the patient is in a hospitalized setting, and the patient will also remain in the hospital for approximately 1 week after the infusion to monitor a number of different blood counts and other tests relating to liver function, relating to blood count status, and potential hypersensitivities. We anticipate that most people will be able to leave the hospital approximately a week afterwards, and we expect that in that period after that first week of monitoring, there's a period of time likely to be 4, maybe 8 weeks, which we call immediate follow-up, where somebody is an outpatient but is remaining in the vicinity of the treating center with relatively frequent visits and rapid access to the physicians and study nurses as needed, and then a longer period of follow-up, during which point people will be living at home, hopefully going about as much of their normal lives as possible, coming to the center for periodic evaluations, and that subsequent follow-up period is expected to last about 3 years. And the follow-up in the initial months is a little more frequent, and then towards the final year or two is really more like every 6 months. And this is obviously quite important, as we really want to capture a lot of information regarding not only how well the treatment works, and how safe the treatment is, but whether that safety and effectiveness are durable. There is likely to be a subsequent long-term follow-up study that patients will be asked to enroll in. It's not mandatory. The FDA and other health authorities are very committed to making sure that we follow patients who've received gene therapy for a reasonably long period of time so that we understand all aspects of the safety. The long-term follow-up study is likely to involve 2 to 5 years of follow-up after the 3-year follow-up period. Fortunately, the amount of testing and the overall intervals between testing are relatively favorable. It would really involve, for most people, probably a yearly visit with fewer tests than have been done during the course of the 3 years of follow-up after investigational infusion. So obviously it's complex, but hopefully this slide breaks it down, and hopefully most of the time that people are on the study is spent outside of the hospital, which is really where we would much rather all be, and I'm assuming you feel the same way. The next slide, what are the costs associated with participation in the gene therapy trial? And the good news here is that we're really making a lot of efforts to make sure that this doesn't come at a cost to patients and their families. And there's support available for travel arrangements, hotel and apartment accommodations for a patient and a family member, food and incidental allowances, and this covers both the initial evaluation, the treatment, and the follow-up visits. So the intention is really to hopefully minimize the financial burden of study participation on patients and families. Next slide, please. And I think that concludes the Cliff Note overview of the study, but obviously I'm sure there will be questions, and I believe we're probably going to be moving into the question portion right now.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and you're absolutely right. We wanted to make sure we devoted most of the time that we had today to answering your questions. As I indicated, thank you so much to those of you who've already submitted questions. You'll see we've embedded those here, and we'll start to walk through them. But by no means, I don't want the audience to feel like you cannot ask questions in real time. So again, if you do have questions, please just type them in, and we will try to address them if we can in real time. And if we can't, we'll get back to you with answers. So next slide, please. Before we jump right into it, again, this is just really helpful for us because we understand that being part of a trial and especially being part of a gene therapy clinical trial, it's a big deal and it's an important decision. And we wanted to ask, and I promise this is our last polling question. When you are considering enrolling in a gene therapy clinical trial, what top 2 factors are important to you? So please pick up to 2 factors that really sort of help you decide whether, if you're eligible, you could participate in the trial. One is how close is the treatment center to your home? 2 is familiarity with the treatment center. I guess I should say A and B. C is COVID-19 and travel-related concerns. D is side effects. E is receiving a placebo. F is none of the above. And G is other. So what goes into your thinking as you decide whether or not to participate in a trial? And you can pick up to 2. And Paulina, are we ready to see the results?
Just a little bit more, there are more coming. Just a few more seconds and we will be done.
Okay, great. We got a little note saying they lost the poll screen, so can we pop that back up? There we go. Hopefully folks can see it again. When considering enrolling in the gene therapy clinical trial, what top 2 factors are important to you?
And please answer again if you see the screen up again.
So if they've answered already, they need to answer again?
Yes.
I think that's a yes. Okay. You can never tell with technical difficulties, can you? You do your best to try to sort through all this. Okay, in the interest of time, Paulina, can we check? Okay, by and large, side effects are one of the most important things that folks think about in deciding whether or not to join a trial. And then after that is how close is the treatment center to home? That's 32%. And of course, in this environment, COVID-19 concerns remain. So thank you all for answering this question. Now, without further ado, it gives me great pleasure, Paulina, if you can go to the next slide, please, for me to introduce our panel of experts. We're really delighted and grateful to have our colleagues here join us to be able to answer your questions. You know, I have to say they're so committed to this community, because when we said, hey, we're thinking about doing this on a Saturday, can you be available? It was a very enthusiastic yes, and how long do you need me to be available? So just wanted to thank our expert panel in no particular order. I'd like to welcome Dr. Barry Greenberg. He is at UC San Diego, as Dr. Schwartz mentioned, and he is our principal investigator for the San Diego site, followed by Dr. Eric Adler, who I know many of you in this community are already familiar with. And as Dr. Schwartz mentioned, it was his lab where the work related to the gene therapy development first occurred. And he's very involved with the community and with natural history efforts as well. Next up is Dr. Matt Taylor, who also is very familiar to this community. He comes to us from the University of Colorado, and he's been in the Danon space for a long time, and is working closely with us and with Dr. Adler in natural history efforts. So welcome, Dr. Taylor. followed by Dr. Joe Rossano, who Dr. Schwartz also mentioned. He comes to us from the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where he will be serving as a principal investigator for our site there. And of course, you all had the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Schwartz already. Okay, next slide. Let's jump right in. Now that we know who's who, to our experts. I might regret saying this, but maybe we can come off of mute so we don't lose time in muting and unmuting. But if there's background noise, I may retract that request. And so let's jump right in. So the first question, I'll ask the question and I'll direct it to one or more of our panel members to answer, but certainly if others want to chime in, please do feel free to chime in with answers. So the first question, we're not beating around the bush here. This really gets to what do we know about the effectiveness. So how well is the gene therapy working in the clinical trial for Danon disease? And Dr. Greenberg, since you are the physician here who's had the privilege of administering the gene therapy to some of our patients already, would you like to address this question, please?
Sure, and I'm delighted to be with the audience today. So thank you, Gayatri, for putting this together, and to Rocket for sponsoring it. Let me start out by just reminding everybody that it really is early days with this therapy. It's a very unique approach, and we're very pleased that we have now taken 3 patients through the initial stages of the study. That is, they went through the pre-screening, the pre-medication, and got the gene therapy, and all of the patients are currently doing well. We're in the process of evaluating whether or not this is helping and working, and that's going to take some time to really get the answer about. But what I can say is that the infusion for the 3 patients went very, very smoothly, and all of the patients are now doing well.
Jonathan, anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, and I think obviously people are very eager, understandably, to know, is this going to make the Danon, my Danon disease better? And we're looking forward to being able to provide some of those first answers for the initial cohort, probably later this year. We've had some delays in terms of getting people evaluated for follow-up visits because of the pandemic, and then obviously some of the tests are very complex and difficult to interpret. But we are committed to providing some of these updates, and likely the best time to do that will be towards the later part of this year, potentially at one of the heart meetings that occur. And one of the things that we'll make sure we do, and we've done this with some of our other programs in different diseases, is that as we're sharing that information with the medical and scientific community, we will also potentially set up a web session with this group and patients and families, so that you're hearing it as quickly as people in the medical and scientific worlds are hearing it.
Thanks, Jonathan, for mentioning that in particular. You know, certainly this information will be provided, as you've indicated, during scientific symposia and meetings, and often that's tough, you know, for folks to really understand, like, what does this really mean, and how do I interpret this data? So we are very committed to making sure that whatever we do present is also presented to the community in a fashion that is applicable to this community as you make the important decisions of what makes sense for you or your loved one. Next question. So we talked a little bit about what do we know about the effectiveness, and as you've heard, it's early. But what's the flip side? What are the risks to the gene therapy, and what are the side effects of the gene therapy? And as we saw in the polling questions, this is one of the key criteria that patients and families consider in terms of whether or not to enroll. So Dr. Greenberg, want to take this one away as well?
Yeah, let me start, and then I'll ask the other panelists to jump in, because many of the others in the group have experience with this. Again, this is early days, and one of the reasons why patients are followed so closely, and we actually ask them to stay close to the study site for the initial 2 to 3 months after gene therapy, is to keep an eye on the patients and to assess on a regular basis whether or not any of the side effects or untoward effects of gene therapy are becoming manifest, and to, with that early surveillance, begin to initiate therapy to mitigate any of these side effects that may develop. Basically, the side effects.
Barry, I think we may have lost you. So where Barry left off, can I ask one of our other panelists to see if you may be able to jump in terms of what are the potential risks to the gene therapy or side effects?
Well, I certainly can help if that's okay until Barry comes back.
Sure.
I think in the good thing is in the extensive preclinical studies of the gene therapy in both mice and then in primates, so in monkeys, we didn't see significant side effects. So that's the good news. We do have to be, we know that the immune system can be activated by the use of gene therapy in general. So we do have patients on some kind of immune suppression. And with the use of immune suppression, there are always side effects of that, being at risk for infections and side effects of those medicines that we use. In terms of the side effects of the therapy itself, as it's been pretty well tolerated during administration, and so that's very good news. And we're watching closely and watch our patients closely, and so far so good. There's some risks that require us to check blood tests pretty frequently. And that can be tough on patients, and we know it, and it requires us to monitor patients pretty closely. I don't know, Jonathan, I'm trying to think. I think it's a little bit, maybe that's better. This question to expand further might be better answered by you.
Eric, I'm back also.
Okay.
I'm afraid that the internet here on Saturday mornings has a tendency to drop out periodically, so I apologize for that. But I did pick up on the end of what you were mentioning about the fact that we get blood tests consistently and look for evidence of abnormalities and treat those. And again, these can be in response to either the virus, which elicits a response, or the production of the normal LAMP protein in the cells in the body. So there are a number of ways of dealing with this, and we look for evidence with all of the blood tests and the other studies that we do for the appearance of these side effects.
Thank you. Is there anything else anyone wanted to add to this question?
I think one other thing that I just think is really important is there are other companies and other hospitals that are also working with very similar types of adeno-associated virus vectors. that are also administered intravenously. Many of these programs are for other diseases of nerves and muscle, such as Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and a number of other different serious diseases. And we pay very close attention to any of the results and safety findings that are made available from those trials as well. And some of those studies have been in existence for longer than the Danon disease study has been. So they have some more patients treated. One of those treatments is actually an approved therapy for a neuromuscular disease that's known as spinal muscular atrophy. And we're determined to make sure that not just findings from our own trial, but also from all the other studies that are being conducted around the world using this type of viral vector, that we're incorporating the safety learnings from these. And that's why we will at times make modifications to the preventative therapies that are given, the immunosuppressive therapies, because sometimes we're learning not just from things that are going on in our own study, but from similar trials, and trying to make sure that any problems or difficulties that were reported with some of these other therapies and programs are not repeated in our own study.
Thank you so much. So if I could just summarize, one of the main criteria that when we talk about risks, we're looking at issues related to the immune system, sort of an immune response to the therapy. So we are monitoring, we monitor closely, we provide immunosuppressants, and these are not out of the ordinary in terms of what's being seen with respect to similar therapies. So this is, I'm just summarizing what I think I've heard our panelists say here. In the interest of time, I'm gonna move to the next slide because we have a lot of questions and I want to make sure we get to them, but I wanted to spend some time there because I do think that this was important. This is a critical question for the community. So next question. Is there any correlation with the type of LAMP2 mutation and the disease severity or prognosis? Matt, I thought this would be a good question for you to start to answer.
Happy to. So good morning, I guess good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. I want to echo Barry's earlier comments of thanking Rocket for putting this together, and I'm excited to have a lot of patients listening right now. So this question comes up because many of you who've been diagnosed, whether it's you or your loved ones, have been diagnosed with a genetic test. And in many cases, that genetic test will tell you that patients in your own family have the same mutation. So each family has its own LAMP2 mutation that's within your own family. But many different families actually typically will have a different mutation. So if you're connected to another Danon family across the country, around the world, the chances that their genetic change and their LAMP2 gene might be different. And so one could wonder whether or not those genetic changes in the mutation could predict the prognosis. And we've got a couple types of mutations listed here. One is a deletion. The second one listed there as split is probably a typo or something you perhaps heard from your doctor but didn't quite get right. That's probably a frame shift mutation. And so within the Danon mutations, there are different categories or classes. At the moment, patients and most families, the mutations have a similar consequence. And that is that the LAMP2 gene has a mutation in it that makes it largely not functional. So we think even though the families may have different mutations in their reports, we don't have a lot of evidence right now that the type of mutation makes a big difference family to family, with a couple of caveats. There are a very small number of mutations, perhaps fewer than 5%, that look like they might predict a milder course of the disease. It's not something we could cover right now, but anybody is more than welcome to email me. We're happy to talk about your mutation if you think you've got one of those mutations. The other thing to realize is that between boys and girls, or men and women, the LAMP2 mutations tend to behave a little bit differently, with boys and men generally having a more consistently severe course, unfortunately, and girls and women, some are as severe as the males, but there's much more variation. We tend to think that the condition starts a little later in women and girls and probably progresses a little bit differently as well.
Thanks, Matt. The next question, sort of keeping in line with genetic mutations, is would the type of mutation impact the effectiveness of the gene therapy? Eric, I thought you might have an interesting perspective on this, given the work that your lab's done.
Sure. So I think most of the mutations that Matt and I have studied, and we've had a long-standing and fabulous collaboration. So I'm really grateful for that. And Matt was really one of the early pioneers in the study of Danon disease, and earns a lot of credit for all of this work. But one of the things that we've noticed is that most of the mutations in Danon patients cause little to no production of protein. So in other words, it's the loss of protein that leads to this disease, which is different than a lot of other diseases in which the protein acts abnormally. In this case, you just don't have enough of the protein. And because of that, it's a particularly good disease to use gene therapy in, because we can just give the gene back, as opposed to other diseases in which we're trying to compete with existing proteins. Here, you just don't have enough, and we're giving more protein back. So that being said, I think that the majority of mutations will be amendable to treatment with the gene therapy that we've developed. So I'm quite optimistic. There are very few mutations in which there seems to be protein made, but those seem to be milder disease and very rare. So I think the vast majority of mutations should be amendable, should be well treated with gene therapy, but we'll see.
Thank you, Eric. Shall we go to the next question? The next question is getting to who is eligible to be in the trial and when. So as Jonathan described, right now the trial is limited to male patients, and right now we were enrolling older male patients. So the question is, when will the trial enroll younger male patients? Jonathan, I think you're probably best poised to answer this question.
Right. And I don't think it's going to be terribly long from now. We will be treating hopefully a couple of older patients at a dose higher than the dose that was given to the first 3 people in the study. I think that our feeling is that if that somewhat higher dose is safe, then we will probably start treating younger patients either at that dose or at a lower dose, depending on the findings. But our goal is to try to make the therapy available to the younger portion of people ages 14 and under as quickly as possible. And it's difficult to say exactly when that could be, but I think our hopes are that would probably be conceivably very early next year, 2021. But obviously that's going to be in part determined by the findings as we treat the next couple of older patients. But it's coming, and hopefully not too soon, not too far from now.
And it's in anticipation of being able to enroll these younger patients that we're really excited to partner with CHOP and with Joe. Joe, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, CHOP's experience with gene therapy. It's really pretty well known and well regarded from that respect. So can you share some perspectives there?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And I'd also would like to echo the sentiments expressed by the other speakers that this is really a wonderful event. And we're at CHOP, really honored to be participating in this study. We really think this is a landmark study, and will hopefully, really provide a therapy that just changes the whole face of the disease. In our experience in children, this is a very serious disease, as everybody here knows, and the therapies are not very good. And so we really have the opportunity here to do something dramatically good for this patient population. CHOP does have a long history of being involved with gene therapy, really from the beginning of the notion that genes can be manipulated in people to provide therapy for diseases outside of cardiovascular diseases initially, and now certainly within neuromuscular disorders. There have been a number of very important studies over the last 5 to 10 years in patients with neuromuscular diseases that shows that gene therapy, I think, is very promising. Adenoviral vector can be used very well for many of these types of problems. So yeah, we're again very, very excited and enthusiastic about the study.
Thanks, Joe. I saw that one of the questions that came in on the chat is very specific to this issue of age. So the question is, will it be available to males as young as 6 years old? Jonathan, thoughts on that?
Certainly, I think as we gain more experience, then we would absolutely consider lowering the age limit. We picked the 8 to 14 range because it seemed like that was a range where most of the patients had started to become diagnosed, and there was an opportunity to intervene. But we're realizing that there may be some patients who are diagnosed earlier than that, and the therapy could conceivably help. Typically, as one tests a new medicine in a younger population, especially as you start to get into smaller and younger kids, the health authorities, the FDA and the European authority, requires a little bit more data in an older group. So typically for a disease that affects kids, they might want you to start in an adolescent population and then treat in younger patients, and then work your way towards the very youngest patients. But certainly if we have good results, especially as we start to get into patients 14 years of age and younger, then we would definitely seek to explore the therapy in patients younger than the age of 8, and hopefully, again, not too far from now. But that would not obviously be in the next year, but conceivably soon thereafter.
Thanks, Jonathan. As you mentioned, it's really an issue of establishing safety, and it is really guided by regulatory requirements of starting in older patients first. Next question. This is the one we get all the time, and it's really top of mind for I know so many folks in the community. So when will the trial enroll female patients? Jonathan?
Sure. So I think in all likelihood, we would need a separate study for female patients. But that's not, creating that is not going to be terribly difficult. I think from a calendar perspective, that's a little hard for me to say with any precision. We understand that this is a disease that affects girls and women, and sometimes it's relatively mild, and sometimes it can be pretty severe. And that it's a substantial concern. It's not just, it's not just like having high blood pressure where you take a couple of medicines and you'll be okay. It's a real disorder. I think as soon as we are confident that we can give this therapy safely and that it is doing something against the Danon disease, that it's preventing that we're able to get the gene and the protein into the heart, and that we're able to see that it's at least stabilizing or preliminary evidence that it's stabilizing the damage that Danon causes, then we're going to seek to very rapidly have a study available for women and girls. And there are going to be some things about that trial that are going to be similar to the current study. There will be some differences because women and girls will often have some different features. But my hope is that certainly within the next 2 years, that program would be activated, and sooner if at all possible. And this is something that, again, as we get more information, as we treat patients, if things are starting to look good, in terms of, okay, we think we found the right dose that we can give safely and it's going to protect people, then we'll get that female study up and running quicker.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think that's a really good segue into the next series of questions, which really sort of get to the natural history of the disease and kind of better understanding what the natural history of the disease is. Before we pivot to that, I just wanted to acknowledge, I see a lot of questions coming in through the chat. I see them. I'm going to try my best to weave them in. Again, if we're not able to address them here, we will make sure that we will address them either separately with you directly, or we will find another way to make sure these questions get addressed. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And the reason, I think this pivots really nicely into the natural history of the disease is, as Jonathan was mentioning, we are currently, the trial is for men and boys. And it's in part because it's a more predictable disease course in some respects, whereas it's much more variable in females. And so that really gets to why it's so important to better understand how this disease progresses, not just in men and boys, but in females. So with that, we wanted to spend some time talking about the natural history and the efforts related to the natural history. So first question is, what issues is the team encountering with respect to enrollment of the natural history study? Sounds like the current is around 100, given the estimated prevalence of the disease. I just wanted to note, we put these questions in as much as we could verbatim from how we got them. So clearly whoever sent this question in watched the video and knows that there is a registry with about 100 patients. So these series of questions, Matt and Eric, I'm just going to ask the two of you to tag team here.
Sure.
Maybe I'll start, and we actually sort of have two natural history studies, if you will, and maybe I'll talk about one and then turn it over to Dr. Adler to talk about the second. I know there's a lot of excitement about the gene therapy, and we should certainly be excited about it, but one of the important questions will be, how do we know it's going to work, and how do we know it has worked? And in rare diseases, it's quite difficult to know what the natural course of the disease is. And so when regulatory agencies, you've heard the FDA mentioned, or those in Europe, will ask at some point, how is this going? How is it working? It really is helpful if we're able to say, well, we know that the normal course of the disease behaves in this way, and that the therapy, in this case gene therapy, has affected that. So the natural history study I will talk about is the one that is largely looking at medical records, and is really what we're often calling the registry. And that's open to any and all patients and all family members. And essentially it is a process that after you sign a consent form, we then have an ability to collect some of your medical records, find out when you were first diagnosed and how you progressed, and really try to learn how the condition starts from when you or your child was healthy to when the symptoms started to diagnosis occurred, and even up to transplant or beyond transplant. We have about 100 patients enrolled currently. We actually have a secure database that was built by one of our pre-medical students, Garrett Storm, who's designed this database. It doesn't really have information that's leaked out. It's all sort of secure and kept confidential. And the more information we have, the more we learn about this disease and this condition. And so if you're not participating, we'd certainly encourage you to think about participating. In terms of publishing this stuff, that's also very important. Our group in Colorado published a study about 10 years ago. Dr. Adler's group, we collaborated with him on a publication last year that looked at some of the known information as well as what had been published in the literature. And one of Dr. Adler's proteges right now is positioning herself to probably publish this information from the current natural history study. And I imagine that that would be sometime later this year or possibly the beginning of next year, because the more information we get out there, the better. And of course, you're sort of hearing me as I'm talking about this, pleading for those of you that are not yet enrolled. We have a slide up coming in a moment about how you could participate if you want to in that part of the study that, again, looks at records and sort of looks back in time about all that's happened to you up to this point, which will then segue into what Dr. Adler can talk about next, which is the prospective study. That's the study that is looking forward that they're currently doing at the University of California at San Diego. So Eric, you should probably chime in on that.
Yeah, so
Eric, I'm so sorry. Before you jump in, I do want to mention one thing to piggyback on what Matt, you were saying. You know, I know for folks sometimes saying, oh, geez, you know, to be in a registry and you want my records, that's going to take a lot of effort and time. And I don't know that I have the time and energy to pull up all that stuff. Well, you know, we're working with both Matt and Eric to try to make that easy so it's not burdensome for you to provide your records to Colorado or San Diego. So we really don't want that to be a deterrent in you joining.
Yeah, we actually have, that's a great point. We actually have a company that we're contracted with. Again, they use the appropriate confidentiality processes. So really, it's relatively easy if you can identify where you or your child has been largely evaluated and seen. This company actually then is very adept at obtaining the records that are important and related to Danon disease. We can then review them and then enter the data into the database. So there's a lot of work involved, but there's actually not very much work for the families and the patients, fortunately.
So apologies, Eric, for jumping in, but please.
No. Yeah, so concomitant to this retrospective chart review study, we've launched in collaboration with Rocket a prospective study where we've had approximately 10 patients come out to San Diego and undergo a physical exam and some testing to help us really understand how this disease changes over time. These really wonderful patients and their families have come, and we do testing, and they come every 3 to 6 months and get repeat testing so we can see over a period of time how the disease changes. That study is limited in size and scope, so we may be enrolling a few more patients in collaboration with Rocket, and we're thinking about expanding in the future. That is open to boys and girls, unlike the trial at the moment. So it's a real important study. We may be looking for some more patients. So if interested, again, email us. It has been a little bit hampered by COVID, but we hope to get things moving again with that study shortly.
Thank you. Next slide. I'm looking at the time. I'm like, wow, we're already at the hour mark. So there's still a number of questions. So I know we're scheduled for 90 minutes. Our hope had been to maybe end a little bit early, but if folks are amenable to just stay on, I think there are a lot of good questions and I want to make sure we get through them. But maybe we can try to be brief as we try to get through all this stuff. Sticking with natural history, based on the research that's being done, specifically the natural history study, is there any additional work being done on how the findings might translate into updates to the current standard of care for Danon disease? So this is really interesting. These are efforts that we're learning about the natural history. So have there been any changes in the standard of care? Or if you look at the next question is there any additional information about changes to the existing whole person interventions like nutrition, diet, exercise? Basically, is there anything that we've learned from the natural history to date that changes or modifies or enhances current standard of care or other interventions? Eric or Matt?
Yeah, I think that's a really informed question and one that we really are interested in ourselves, because clearly gene therapy is going to be only available for so many people and it's only available to a limited number of people at this time. I think the natural history study has been informative about the disease in women, and we're learning more and more about this disease in women. And one of the papers that Matt and I worked on that Michela Brambati, who used to be in my lab, published clearly showed that this disease is significant in women, and that we have to take it seriously. Sometimes with X-linked diseases, doctors are not as worried about the disease in women, but clearly we show that this disease can be significant in women. In terms of current standard of care, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I still think there's a lot of questions about what medicines to use, when is the right time for defibrillators, when is the right time for cardiac transplantation. And those are questions that Matt and I field all the time from other doctors, from patients, and I hope to answer some of those. I don't think I really have a great handle. I do think that what we are learning is that probably a lot of the medicines and therapies that we think apply to patients with heart failure may or may not be helpful in patients with Danon disease. And certainly there are a lot of side effects that might be more exaggerated in patients with Danon disease. I do think nutrition, diet, and exercise are really important questions. I hope we have the resolution in our study to answer that. I can't say that we will, but knowing how this disease works, I think there's probably some interesting things that we can do with nutrition that might be actually quite impactful. And we hope to answer that in the future.
So this is still a work in progress, and the hope is to be able to provide additional information through the course of conducting these studies that could impact standard of care and otherwise.
Gayatri, can I jump in for a moment?
Of course, yes, please.
One of the things that I think is worth mentioning is that the usual clinical presentation of Danon is with the cardiac abnormalities, particularly in boys and young men. And often the way that it looks to the clinicians who see these patients is cardiac hypertrophy. And there are a lot of other diseases that cause hypertrophy. And the way you differentiate them much more definitively is by getting genetic testing. So the role of genetic testing, I think, has emerged as a really important diagnostic modality. And I think that really needs to be emphasized. particularly to this audience?
Yeah, I would just, oh,
Please, Joe. Yes.
oh, sorry, I would just reiterate that it is so important. And, you know, very likely the earlier we start therapy, the better the disease will be. So diagnosing children early in the disease, and the only way that it will happen is with genetic testing. And I'm sure we underdiagnose this. You know, there's thick hearts and it's attributed to something else. And, you know, and if years go by and then some bad event happens and the diagnosis is never made, you know, that's a real, just, you know, incredible lost opportunity. So
I'm so glad you both made that point, because certainly one of our hopes is to increase in the minds of cardiologists to consider genetic testing in these sorts of presentations. Next slide, please. As Matt and Eric have alluded to here, if you are interested in the natural history study, in any of its iterations, whether it is to be part of the medical records portion of the study to answer the questionnaire, or to be part of the ongoing, you know, longitudinal study that Eric talked about, please do feel free to contact Matt or Eric. Their contact information is here. And then we'll provide additional contact information at the end, so we will make sure you get to the right people. The one thing before we switch topics here, I wanted to reiterate is sort of bridge what we were talking about with younger males, females, and natural history study. And when trials might be, when the gene therapy trial might be available to, for example, the female population. Our hope is really, as we understand the benefit risk in the male population, as we're enrolling in the gene therapy trial, and as we understand the disease progression in females, our hope is to really be able to open a trial in females for the gene therapy. It is a little bit difficult to guesstimate in terms of timing, but it could be even as early as 18 months from now. But again, don't hold me to that. This is all, a lot of things sort of need to come together to be able to make that happen. So this really gets to a good segue regarding timelines and sites. And I think, Jonathan, I'm probably going to tee you up for these questions. And this really has to do with, you know, is there a way to speed up trial timelines? Can there be additional sites, you know, whether in the US or overseas?
Thank you, Gayatri. So certainly, speeding things up is something that's feasible, but obviously is not something we want to do at the expense of safety. We have some changes that have been written into the program that will enable us to test new doses in cohorts of 2 patients as opposed to 3 patients. And that's important because obviously it takes longer to treat 3 people than it does to treat 2. And we have the FDA as well as the Institutional Review Board endorsement for that from both San Diego and Pennsylvania. Our hope is that our friends in Colorado will be able to join in the not too distant future, but I don't want to talk about timelines with respect to that yet, although that's something that we're pursuing with reasonably aggressively. The intent for this program is that it will not just be a US program. And really, once we have completed the phase 1 portion where we have understood the safety and have evaluated a number of different doses and feel that we have a safe dose that is likely to be helpful to people. That's when we would have, we would finish the phase 1, and then we would open up phase 2 studies in those phase 2 studies, enrollment is not restricted. We don't have to treat one patient and then wait for them to get to a certain 2 or 3 month time point before we go to the next. We can treat several people, or really all, in the same time frame. At that point, as we go to phase 2, that's when we will be able to have a Danon study in Europe, and potentially at some point subsequently, maybe even in Japan. The goal is that this, and we actually do have some partners and centers that we have been talking to in Europe. Fortunately, a lot of Rocket's other programs in some of the blood diseases are active in Europe. So we have experience working with the European Health Authority and with different medical centers, especially in London and Madrid, Spain, where there are some centers that have real expertise in both gene therapy and in this kind of heart problem. So this will be expanded overseas if things continue to go according to plan.
Thanks, Jonathan. So just to recap then, yes, the goal is to eventually add additional sites and to hopefully have a site at a minimum in Europe, and likely at least with respect to overseas sites, hopefully when we get to phase 2. There's a question here that I think is relevant. It says, at what stage, it popped up, hang on, it's about phase 2. At what stage of the timeline is considered phase 2? I think what we're getting at is, when do we say that we've reached phase 2?
Right, and that could be fairly soon. That could be sometime in the middle of 2021. It's really going to depend on the safety of each dose, and how, both in older and younger patients, and it's going to depend on how well we think the therapy is working. If we think we need a higher dose to make it work better, then that's going to slow things down to getting to phase 2, because it means that we're going to now test at least 2 more patients in each age group at that higher dose. If we have, if we get to a dose that looks like it's working and that's safe, then we can say, all right, it's time to get phase 2 started. So it could be in 2021, or it could be in 2022. I'm very hopeful that it's not going to be later than that.
Okay, let's move on. I think the next series of questions, these were interesting questions, and they're all sort of grouped in and around the idea of what happens if you've had a heart transplant or may need a heart transplant. So the first question is, if you've gotten a transplant, is a transplanted heart susceptible to disease damage like the original heart? And I thought those would be good questions for our cardiologists here.
I'll take a shot at the first one. Once you transplant the heart, you're taking out the cells that have the genetic abnormality, and you're putting in a new set of cells that don't have the genetic abnormality. The cardiac cells, unlike cells elsewhere in the body, don't replicate. So the ones that you get in the transplanted heart are the ones that you end up keeping. and you won't be susceptible to cardiac damage, at least from the Danon in the future.
Anything anyone else wanted to add to that question? Okay. Next is, again, keeping with the questions related to transplant. Does the gene therapy jeopardize a potential future heart transplant? So what if you're a patient who did get the gene therapy and maybe it didn't work? Can you get a heart transplant after that? And I would have to guess that our PIs would get this question, you know, when they're talking to patients considering gene therapy. So I'm curious as to Joe and Barry's response to this question. And of course, Eric, I suspect you've got thoughts here as well.
We haven't seen, at least in the 3 patients that we've studied, and I have trouble thinking of any theoretical reasons why there would be an issue about a potential future heart transplant.
I think the only concern would be the development of antibody in response to the gene therapy. And we don't know. We haven't seen it. I don't know if we've really, it hasn't come up yet. It hasn't, and maybe Joe would know, I don't think it's come up in other gene therapy programs. But I would, you know, in spirit of total transparency, I hope everyone recognizes this is where we are in new territory. This is the first gene therapy for a cardiac disorder like this, a monogenetic disorder. I think Barry might have some insight into a previous gene therapy trials, a Cupid trial, and I don't think we saw any increase in antibody, but I don't know if we looked or if you have any thoughts on that, Barry.
Yeah, no, I was involved in an earlier gene trial. This was in adult patients with heart failure, quite different from the genetic disorder here, but it was gene therapy nonetheless, and that issue did come up, and we didn't find any problems with individuals being candidates for transplant in the future. It was a larger study, and in that study, somewhere around 125 to 150 people got treated with gene therapy using a viral vector, but obviously a different gene target.
Yeah, I don't think I'd have too much to add other than I agree. I think it's unlikely that we would see a significant problem that would preclude a future transplant. I think Eric's point, though, is one that is well taken, that in anything like this, there are unknowns, and there could be some anticipated issue that we don't anticipate that could become evident over years to come. I will say this notion, you know, so these antibodies are typically these anti-HLA antibodies or antibodies that could, recognize a potential donor heart and attack it and cause damage. This is a very big issue in pediatric heart transplantation because of congenital heart disease. And I will say that outside of homograft material being used, so a cadaveric tissue being implanted into a patient, we almost never see major sensitization. We can have minor degrees of these, anti-HLA antibodies, but in the absence of cadaveric tissue being sewn into the body and, left there, we really don't see that. We've worried about it in things of like stem cell therapies, if those have been, allogeneic and sourced, meaning the stem cells are coming from another a donor. But even then, it's really, I think, just been a modest response that has typically been seen.
Thank you all. And sort of rounding out the series of questions, if you've already gotten a heart transplant, certainly the trial as it's currently designed, if you've received a heart transplant, you're not eligible for the trial. But thinking ahead, could a patient who've received a heart transplant ever receive the gene therapy? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I don't know. I think we would want to do further study to see if there's benefit to people who've had a heart transplant and also what the risks would be because of the medicines that are used in heart transplant and risk of rejection. So I think that's a to be determined question. It comes up a fair amount, actually.
Okay. Before we move on, there's a question that came in through the chat that I think folks might have, and the question really involves what is dose actually mean in this context of a gene therapy, without really going into the specifics necessarily of what dose is being given. Can we provide some background on what do we mean by a dose here in this context?
Well, the dose refers to the number of viral particles that contain a normal copy of the gene. And those are calculated prior to the administration of the drug. And the dose will actually describe the number of particles, the virus and the gene that the patient is going to get.
Great, thank you. Can we go on? And I am trying to be respectful of time here, but there's just some great questions here that I feel like I've got the experts and I want to be able to utilize their time to try to answer as many questions as we can. So let's move on to the next series of questions. And these questions really have to do in and around with what's the impact that we think this gene therapy is going to have to the other manifestations of Danon disease, you know, like the muscle, cognitive, eye, liver. Can it get to the brain? I sort of see 1 and 2 as one, and then I got to imagine our PIs are going to get this question like, you know, what does this mean in terms of future reproductive ability? So let's keep those two separate. So in terms of, do we think that this is going to affect the other manifestations of Danon? Eric, I think given your preclinical work, I'd be interested in your thoughts here.
So in our preclinical work, we studied, certainly studied the muscle and liver. It's harder to study cognitive issues in the mouse. And it looks like actually the liver was particularly responsive to therapy. The muscle may have been somewhat responsive to therapy, not as much as in the liver or the heart. But we will see as the trial goes on whether those things are true in patients as well. In terms of the eye, we don't know. We don't think so based on this virus and its ability to penetrate the eye, but we're not sure. We're doing some studies in mice right now looking at that. And then the cognitive problems, and it gets to this question of the blood-brain barrier. We do see some virus in the brain. This isn't a virus that is known to really strongly transduce in the brain. But we do see some virus in the brain, and it will really, I think it's to be determined. I must say, I don't see this as, I wouldn't be too hopeful that this is going to reverse cognitive defects, especially ones that are have already developed. But we don't know. This is new territory, so I think it's also to be determined.
Okay, that's fair.
Gayatri, can I jump in again for
Of course, yes, of course.
Comment here. This is really a great question because it is a multi-system disorder with the cardiac manifestations really predominating. One of the things that we really want to do in the clinical trial is to look at the effects on all of the other organ systems that may be involved, so that the testing that we do both at baseline to see if there are abnormalities and then after therapy over an extended period of time really addresses this question of whether or not there are potential benefits in these other organ systems. so that hopefully at the end of the day, we'll have an answer to that. But right now, the therapy that's been devised is really devised to address the main problem, and that's the cardiac problem. But it is possible that there will be some effects on the other organ systems.
And what would either you, Barry, or Joe would tell patients who came in about what the impact might be on reproductive cells or fertility down the line?
Well, I don't think it would affect fertility, but I think that the risks of passing it on would be the same unless we think it gets into the germline cells, which I don't believe we do. But Eric, you may, or others, be able to comment on that if you think it would have.
Yeah, we don't think it does. We don't think there's transduction into germline cells.
Yeah. It's a great question.
And you know, it shouldn't be persistent in dividing cells by definition, because it's a gene therapy. So because these germline cells are dividing a lot, it should, even if there was transduction, I would think over time it would be reduced significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And so the main takeaway is we don't expect the gene therapy at this point to have any effect on reproductive cells, as this question is asked. And we would not anticipate at this point for it to have an impact on fertility.
Yeah, and another way to think about it, for good or bad, is we don't expect it to cure, to provide cure to future generations. You know, it's not changing the gene itself. So
I think that's a really great way to think about it. Okay, we've got one last question that I know, and Jonathan, if you could answer it quickly, and then I want to do some quick wrap up and try to all do it in the next few minutes. One question we've got, just given the current environment that we're living in, folks are reluctant to travel. So what happens if maybe, would it be feasible to get the therapy or to get infusion at one site and maybe get followed up at another site? Is that feasible?
Yes. It's not ideal from a logistics perspective, but our goal is to really build this program around patients and to focus on Danon disease patients' needs and safety and well-being. So if this is something that is if this is a situation, then we're gonna find a way to make it happen, and we'll do our best to really work all together as a single team, so that the burden on patients and their families is minimized.
Thank you. Let me just spend another 2 minutes just kind of wrapping up here. Next slide, please. I guess we know we're at the closing. I wanted to also introduce my colleague, Latika Hickey, who you've probably seen her name and you've seen her here. She is my partner in crime as part of the patient advocacy team. And I'm really pleased to have her on board. If we could go to the next slide, I just wanted to share with everyone who we are and what we do at Rocket, because you guys may not be familiar with who we are and what we do. Our goal is really simple. Our goal is really to work with the patient community and really just serve as a resource for you. So what does that really mean? What it means is we want to try to provide education, educational resources to you, be able to answer any questions you might have, and do things like this that we hope were helpful to you. We also want to be able to serve as a triage. You know, we know that there's a lot of information, a lot of people. Where do you go for what? You know, so feel free to think of us as a triage. You know, so if you're not sure where to go, you know, do I go to Eric? Do I go to Joe? Where do I go? Come to us and we'll tell you where you need to go, and we would be happy to serve that resource. And for folks who are considering enrolling in the trial or are enrolled in the trial, you know, we understand that being part of a gene therapy trial, it's a big commitment, you know, and it's one that is not taken lightly. And we understand that, and we really respect and value that. And so our goal is really, for those of you who are considering being in the trial or in the trial, our goal here at Rocket Pharma is to make sort of the actual participation in the trial, the logistics of the trial, to try to be as seamless as possible. And so we really try to work closely with our clinical sites to try to make that happen, and to really kind of resolve issues as they come up. You know, there are new and challenging issues in COVID-19. There are immigration challenges. And so we really try to work with the sites to try to issue spot and problem solve. We of course want to do everything in a really compliant manner. So Latika and I are sort of a separate team from our clinical study team, who's really part of, you know, designing the trial and evaluating the data and monitoring the data. So it's really a priority for us to make sure that we can communicate with you, but that your information will be kept confidential and will not be disclosed. So with that, I really just want to end on a few notes. One, again, is can you just go back to the last slide again? If you have questions and you don't know where to go, if you take nothing away from this, just please email us at Danon Disease Clinical Trial at rocketpharma.com. Again, that's Danon Disease Clinical Trial at rocketpharma.com. And the person who reads those emails is Latika, so you have a face with an email address, and she will get back to you. And we will make sure that we send you to the right place. And on that note, I just really wanted to thank our panelists for their time today. I recognize it's a Saturday, so thank you so much for your time. Really wanted to thank Kim and Jenny and Amy, who run the Facebook support group, for really working with us in getting the word out. We could not have been able to do this without you, so thank you so much for your support. Huge shout out to Latika for really doing the yeoman's share and putting this together. And again, I know a lot of questions came in that we probably did not get to. We will commit to getting back to you on answers with those questions. So thank you very much. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel, as are the other recordings, and we will likewise be sending this out through the Facebook group, so you should be able to see this if you have not been able to see it all, or if you need another iteration to digest. So on that note, thank you all very much for your time this morning. We hope this was time well spent.